Just past 6 o'clock on a cold October morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge and while the frost still lay white and unbroken on the wagon ruts, the first jars began to tick on the long plank inside the stone house, one after another, a small dry sound like a clock made of glass. And each tick meant a lid had drawn down and sealed, and each seal meant another jar of red amber jelly had held. And outside in the cold, the line of people went on standing and waiting, the way people wait for a thing they need and are ashamed to have doubted. They stood the way a congregation stands. They had their hats in their hands, the men who had hats, and the women had their baskets over their arms, and their coats buttoned to the throat, and the line ran from the low door of the stone house, down the orchard track between the old crooked trees, and out to the road, and nobody talked much, because there was nothing left to say, that the standing did not say better. Some of them had come 9 miles, some of them had money folded flat and warm from being held, and every single one of them, or near enough to it that the difference did not matter, had laughed at her once, out loud, in the street in front of the feed store, 8 months and a little more before. Inside, at the plank, a young woman moved down the row of cooling jars with a rag in one hand, and she did not hurry, and she did not look at the door, and she wiped each jar clean of the sugar that had crept up the side in the boiling, and she turned each one so the light came through it, and where the light came through it, the jelly was the color of a garnet held up to a lamp, clear all the way down, no cloud, no weep, set firm as a struck thing. Her name was Della Roan. She was 24 years old that autumn, and she had come into that valley 3 winters earlier with a dead husband's debt and a borrowed coat, and she owned, at the hour I am telling you about, one of the finest small things a person in that county could own, and it had cost her, to begin with, exactly $6. $6, remember that. 700 pounds of fruit that the whole county had called garbage, hauled off in a borrowed cart for $6, while grown men leaned on the rail and laughed until they had to wipe their eyes, and out of that garbage, by October, a jelly with a waiting list. There were 41 names on the list that hung by a nail on the doorframe, and more came every day, and she could not make it fast enough, not that autumn. And the truth of why she could not was a truth none of them standing in that line yet understood, though it stood over them the whole time, quiet, in the shape of the very house they were waiting outside of. Because the stone house was the secret, not the recipe, which she would have told to anyone who asked plainly, and not the fruit, which anyone could have carted off any of the years it lay rotting and free. The stone house. They stood outside its wall in the cold, and none of them knew what it had been, or what ran under its floor, or how a young widow with no money and no name had come to be the one standing inside it while they stood outside, and she was not going to tell them, not that morning, because a thing like that is not told. It is uncovered slowly the way she had uncovered it, one season at a time, with her hands. She set the wiped jar down among the others, and it caught the first real light of the day through the small east window, and it burned there red on the plank like a coal that would not go out. Then she took up her book from the shelf by the window, the plain ledger with the black cover gone soft at the corners, and she opened it to the day's page, and she wrote the date at the top the way she wrote it every morning, and under it she began to set down, in her small, even hand, how many jars had sealed in the night, and how many had failed, and which trees the failed ones had come from. Because she kept the record. She had always kept the record. And the keeping of it was the whole of how she had gotten from that street in front of the feed store to this plank in this stone house, though not one soul in the county had ever thought to count it as a thing worth having. Outside the door, a child stood a little apart from the line, a thin grave girl of 9 or 10 in a coat too big for her, and she was not waiting to buy. She was waiting to be let in, to take up her own smaller book and begin her own morning's counting, because Della had taught her to. The line watched the child the way you watch a thing you do not understand and have decided not to ask about. The frost held on the ruts. The jars ticked, one and then another, small and dry and sure, and the whole cold, bright morning turned on that sound, and the answer to it was buried, and I will get to it, but not yet. Now let me tell you about the house and what waited under it, because that is where the story truly begins, and where, In the end, it comes home to rest. The stone house stood at the top of the old orchard, at the place where the ground rose and then leveled into a shelf against the hill, and it had been standing there, roofless and full of brush, and forgotten, for the better part of 40 years before Delarone ever set eyes on it. It was made of the gray fieldstone of that country, laid up dry and true, by hands that had known exactly what they were doing, walls 2 feet thick at the base and squared at the corners, and it was long and low and windowless but for one small opening high in the east gable, and the men who built it had built it to last past the memory of anyone who could say why. By the time Della found it, ivy had pulled half the north wall into a slump, and a young ash tree had come up through the doorway, and the roof was long gone to rot and rain, and the county, on the few occasions the county thought of that hill at all, called it the old alt ruin, and did not think of it further. But it had been a cider house. That was the thing nobody in that valley remembered anymore, or if a few of the very old ones remembered it, they had stopped saying so, because cider had gone out of the county the way a language goes out, one funeral at a time. The Alts had built it to press their fruit, and the long, low room had once held a great screw press, and rows of barrels and the sweet reek of pomace in October. And the whole hillside above and around it, 40 acres of it, had been planted in trees for that one purpose, in the sour, hard little apples that make the drink keep and bite, and the house had been the heart of all of it, the place all that fruit came down to. And under its floor, which is the part that matters, which is the part I am asking you to hold in your mind through everything that comes, there was a spring, a capped spring. The Alts had found it when they leveled the shelf for the house, a cold, hard vein of water coming clean out of the hillside, and they had been wise about it the way people used to be wise about water. And they had laid a low stone arch over the head of it and floored the house across the top so that the spring ran always through a channel down one side of the room, under a lid of flat stone, cold as iron even in August, and it had kept their cider and their butter and their milk through summers that killed weaker men's stores. And then the family had thinned and gone, and the last of them had capped the spring proper with a fitted stone and a plug of lead before he left. The way you close a well, you mean someone to find whole. And he had died in a city 200 miles off with no children, and the water had gone on running under the stone in the dark all those 40 years, patient, waiting, telling no one, because water is never told how to stop. Della did not know any of that the first time she climbed to the top of that orchard. Nobody had told her, because there was nobody left who knew to tell. She had come up the hill after the fruit, that first autumn, following the windfalls uphill from the road the way you follow a smell, and she had stood in the doorway where the ash tree grew and looked at the tumbled gray stone and the brush and the one small high window, and she had felt only that it was a made thing, that hands had meant it, and that it was cool inside, even in the sun. She had put her palm flat on the inside of the standing wall and felt the cold come off it, a deep, steady cold that did not belong to an October morning, and she had wondered at it. And then she had gone on after the apples, because the apples were what she had come for, and she could not yet afford to wonder long about anything. But the cold had stayed with her. It stayed with her all that winter, in the rented room in town where the wind came through the sash, the memory of that deep, even cold coming off a wall. And a person who has been truly poor learns to remember cold and its opposite the way other people remember faces. And she filed it away without knowing why, the way she filed everything away, and it sat in her the way the spring sat under the stone, unopened, waiting, until the season came round when she would need it, and go looking, and find it, and understand at last what she had been standing on top of the whole time. The buried thing was there from the first page of her story. She just could not read it yet. Neither, for a good while, could I have told you it was coming, though I knew, and now you know, and we will keep it between us until she uncovers it herself. For now, hold the spring in your mind, running in the dark under the stone. Hold the house. We are going back to the beginning, to the winter she came into that country with nothing, and I will show you exactly how much nothing that was. She came in the last week of February, 3 winters before the morning of the jars, on the back of a produce wagon that let her down at the crossroads because it was going no farther, and she walked the last 2 miles into the town with everything she owned. And I can tell you exactly what that was. Because a person's poverty is not a feeling, it is a list, and the list is the truest thing you can know about them. She owned one carpet bag with a broken clasp that she held shut with a leather strap. She owned the coat on her back, which was a man's coat, her dead husband's brother's, given to her the way people give you a thing so they will not have to give you anything else. She owned 2 dresses, one on her and one in the bag, and a change of underthings washed thin, and a pair of good boots that had been resoled once and would need it again before spring. She owned her mother's paring knife with the blade worn to a curve, and a whetstone, and a tin cup, and a wooden spoon, and a heavy iron pot with a lid, the one thing of any weight she had carried out of the marriage, because a woman who has cooked for a living knows that the pot is worth more than the ring. She owned $4 and some odd cents, knotted into the corner of a handkerchief, and she owned a debt. The debt was $91, and it was not hers by any justice, it was her husband's, run up at a store in the last coughing months of his sickness for medicines that did not save him, and the store had sold the paper to a man in this county, which is how she came to be walking into this town and not another, chasing the one thin thread of a cousin who might take her in, and who, when she arrived, had already moved on west, so that she came to a door that opened on strangers and closed again. She owed $91 to a man named Crandall, who kept a ledger of his own, and who was patient in the way of men who charge interest, and she paid it the only way she could, $1 and $2 at a time, out of the wash she took in and the floors she scrubbed and the extra bread she baked before dawn and carried around to sell. And it took her the first year to pay $11 of it, which tells you how the rest of the year went. She rented a half of an attic room over the harness shop for $1.25 a month, and she shared the stove on the landing with a deaf old man who mended chairs, and she carried her water up 2 flights, and she was cold from the last week of February to the middle of May, and cold again by the middle of October. She was 21 when she came and looked older, and she had buried a husband at 20 and a child, a boy, who had lived 4 days before that. And she did not speak of either, not once, not that first year, nor for a long time after. And the not speaking got taken by the town for coldness, or for pride, or for slowness, when it was only a door she had shut because she could not afford to open it and still get up in the mornings. That was what she owned and what she owed. No money to speak of, and no standing, and no name. She was not from there, which in that country was a wound that did not heal, and she was a widow young enough to be a worry to the wives, and a poor enough one to be no use to the husbands, and she had no people, and she had no man, and she had nothing anyone could see to make of her anything but a case, a thing the town would have to decide about. And decide about her they did, and quickly, the way small places do. But the deciding took a turn that was harder to carry than plain unkindness would have been, and it is that turn I want to show you next, along with the one thing about her that the whole town looked straight at and never once saw. They pitied her. That was the verdict, and it came down within a season of her arrival, and I want you to understand that pity, in a place like that, is a heavier thing to carry than scorn, because scorn you can stand up against, and pity leaves you nothing to push on. If they had hated her, she could have hardened to it. Instead, the women brought her the worn-out things and the leftover things, the heel of a ham, the dress a daughter had outgrown, the chair with the cane seat gone, and they brought these things with soft voices and soft eyes, and the particular gentle shake of the head that says, without a word, that they had looked at her whole life and totted it up and found it wanting, and did not expect it to come to anything, and they were being kind about it, and there is no answer you can make to that kind of kindness. None, and she made none. The kindest of them said, among themselves, that it was a shame, a young thing like that, no husband and no prospects, and that hard flat way of talking, and they meant it. The shame they felt was real, and they folded it up small and set it beside her name and moved on. The men did not think of her much at all, which is its own kind of verdict. The children called her the washwoman and were not wrong. And so the county, having weighed her, set her down on the low shelf where it kept the ones it had given up on, gently, with a shake of the head, and there she would have stayed, another quiet, sad woman in a coat too big for her, if she had been what they thought she was, which she was not. Because here is the thing they did not see, and could not have priced if they had. Delarone watched. She watched the way most people breathe, without knowing she was doing it and without being able to stop, and she remembered what she watched, and she wrote it down. She watched which of the wives paid cash and which let it ride to the end of the month, and which never quite paid at all. She watched which fields on the road out of town came up first in the spring, and which held the water and which burned dry, and she knew, by the second summer, whose hay would be short before the men who owned the hay knew it. She watched the weather the way a sailor does, not for poetry but for use, and she watched what grew and what soured, and what kept. And above all, though nobody had yet given her a reason to, she watched food. She watched what happened to fruit and milk and grain, in the heat and the cold, what turned and what held and why, and she carried in her a plain steady patience for the slow proof of things that the town, if it had known the word for it, would still not have thought to want. And she kept the record. That was the shape her watching took. From that first winter she kept a book, a cheap ledger she bought for a nickel and guarded like scripture, and in it she wrote down, in a small even hand, the things she saw, the prices and the weathers, and the small hard facts of the place. And she wrote down what she owed and what she had paid of it to the dollar. And later, when the fruit came into her life, she wrote down that too, every batch and every failure and every tree, and the book grew thick and soft at the corners and went everywhere with her. The town saw a poor widow with a nickel notebook and thought, if it thought anything, that it was a sad little habit. They did not know they were looking at the one tool in that whole valley that would, in time, undo a smooth man with a leather case full of paper. They saw the pot and the coat and the knife. They never saw the book. That was their mistake, and it was a long time paying off, and it paid in full. Now I have to tell you about the apples, because to understand what she did, you have to understand exactly what it was she took, and why every reasonable person in that county was right to call it garbage, and how it had come to be garbage in the first place, for it had not always been so. The trees on the hill were the alt trees, and the alts had planted them near 70 years before, when the county was new, and cider was not a shame but a staple, a thing every farm made and drank and bartered, and the man who planted them, the first alt, had known his fruit the way a smith knows iron. He had not planted the sweet, soft-eating apples that rot by Christmas. He had planted the hard, sour-keeping kind, the little cider crabs, and among them one that was his own, that he had raised up from seed over years of watching and grafting and throwing out the ones that did not do, a small, ugly, red-streaked crabapple, no bigger than a walnut, so sour it drew your mouth shut to bite it, and so hard it kept in a cellar till April. And the family called it the Alt Red, and it made a cider that men rode a day to trade for, and the whole hill was given over to it and its cousins, 40 acres, better than 200 trees, and the stone house at the top pressed it every fall. And then the world turned, the way it does, without asking the trees. Cider fell out of fashion, and then out of favor, and then out of the law itself in those years, and the sweet dessert apple came in on the railroads, the big red pretty ones a child would eat from the hand, and a sour little crab you could not eat and could no longer legally press was worth exactly nothing, less than nothing, because it still had to be cleaned up off the ground. The alts thinned and died and went, as I told you, the last of them capping the spring and going off to the city, and the hill went to the county for taxes nobody wanted to pay, on land nobody wanted. And the trees, left alone, did what old trees do. They did not die, they went wild, and they went on bearing. Every single autumn, faithful past all reason, better than 200 old trees threw down their hard, sour, red-streaked fruit onto the ground, and no one came. And it lay there in drifts and rotted and drew the wasps and the deer and the wandering hogs, 700 and 800 pounds of it in a good year, a stink and a nuisance. And the county cursed it and now and then paid a man a few dollars to rake and burn the worst of it near the road so the smell would not carry. And every use anyone had ever tried for that fruit had failed, which is why the calling of it garbage was not stupidity, it was experience. You could not eat it, it was too sour and too hard and too small, and the one child a decade who bit one never bit a second. You could not sell it, for there was no press left in the county and no market for cider fruit in a dry county besides. You could not even feed it out easy, for the hogs bloated on the windfall and the horses would not touch it. A woman had tried, years back, to make apple butter of it and scorched a whole day's work to a bitter black ruin because she did not understand what she had, and the story of her failure had become the county's proof that the alt fruit was good for nothing, and it got told to Della, as a warning, the first time she asked about the hill. Leave it be, they told her. Better women than you have burned good sugar on those spitters and got nothing for it but a ruined pot. So the fruit was not garbage by accident or by laziness. It was garbage by a lineage of real defeats, planted by a wise man, orphaned by a changing world, useless to every ordinary appetite and every ordinary market, and every ordinary hand that had tried it. It had beaten everyone who ever came at it the ordinary way, and that, though not one of them could have told you so, was exactly the thing that made it hers, because Delarone had never once in her life been able to come at anything the ordinary way, having never had the ordinary means, and she had learned instead to look hard at what the world had thrown down and ask what it was actually good for, which is a different question than what it is supposed to be good for, and it is the only question she ever really asked, and she was about to ask it, out loud, with $6 in front of the whole town. It happened on a Saturday in the first week of that 3rd October, on the courthouse steps, which was where the county did its small public business. And it happened in front of a crowd because the county had put up the season's windfall from the alt place to be cleared, as it did most years, and Coyle the road overseer stood on the step with his book to take the low bid from whatever man wanted a few dollars to go up the hill and rake and burn the mess before the smell got bad. Nobody wanted it. It was a chore, not a prize. And into the middle of that, in her mended boots and her too big coat, stepped Delarone, and she did not bid to be paid to clear it. She offered to pay to keep it. $6, she said, for the right to haul off the whole of it. All of it. Every pound on the ground and every pound still on the trees. She said it plain and flat and once, the way she said everything, and she laid the money on the step. And for a moment, the men on the steps did not understand her, and then they did, and then they laughed. They laughed the way a crowd laughs when it is given permission to, all together, the loud, helpless barking laugh of men who have been handed something to feel superior about on a slow Saturday, and it rolled off the steps and down the street, and Coyle laughed too as he wrote it in his book, $6, the widow Roan, the alt windfall, and one man called out to ask, was she going to marry the wasps? And another said to save him a jar of her spitter pie, and the laughing went on longer than the joke, because the joke was not really the fruit. The joke was her, a poor fool woman paying good money for the one thing in the county everyone agreed was worthless. She did not laugh, and she did not color, and she did not hurry. She took up her receipt, and she folded it once, the way a person folds a thing they mean to keep, and she put it in her coat, and she walked down through the middle of them with her chin held level, and she went to borrow a cart. There was one man on those steps who did not laugh, and he came to her that same afternoon while she was loading the first of the fruit into the borrowed cart at the foot of the hill, an old man, poor as a fence post, foreign in his tongue, that the town called Old Silas, and paid no more mind to than it paid her. He had been something once in another country, a maker of things from apples, verjuice, and sour cider, and a hard perry from pears, and he had come down in the world to almost nothing and lived in a shack by the creek, and was reckoned simple because he spoke slow and strange. He walked up to the cart and looked at the fruit a long while, and he picked up one of the little red-streaked crabs and turned it in his fingers and smelled it and did not eat it. And he looked at her with something in his face that was not pity, the first face in 3 years that had held no pity, and he told her the thing that she would carry the rest of her life and say again, word for word, at the very end of it. The sourest fruit, he said, keeps the truest sweetness, and it gives it up to no one but the patient hand. Then he set the apple back on the heap, gentle, the way you set down a thing that is worth more than it looks, and he showed her with 2 fingers the trick of it, pressing the little apple against the ball of his thumb to feel how it held together hard and would not go to mush, and he said one more thing, that these were the old kind, the keeping kind, the kind that set, and that the town had forgotten what its grandfathers knew, and that she had not been foolish on those steps. She had been the only one there who was not. Then he went back to his shack by the creek. But he had given her the key, and she knew a key when it was put in her hand, and she took the 700 pounds home to find the lock. The mechanism was not magic, and I am going to tell it to you plainly, because the whole worth of this story rests on your believing that it could be done, that a skeptic standing at her elbow that first long night would have started out certain she would fail, and ended up, against his own will, conceding that it might just work. There was no trick to it that money could buy. There was only knowing, and patience, and the willingness to do slow, careful work that no one was paying for, over and over, until it came right. What the county had forgotten, and what old Silas knew, and what Della learned that first autumn, with her worn paring knife and her one iron pot, was that the sour little crabapple is not poor in what matters for jelly. It is rich in it. The very things that made it useless for eating, the hardness and the mouth-drawing sourness and the tough skin, were the signs of what it carried. For those apples were thick with the natural pectin and the acid that make a jelly stand up clear and firm without a thing added to it, where the big, sweet railroad apples everyone prized were so poor in both that their juice would not set at all without help and boiled down to a cloudy weeping sludge. She did not know the chemist's words for it and did not need them. She knew what set and what did not, because she watched, and she wrote it down. And the fruit that the county threw away was the fruit that would hold. She did it the long way, the only right way, and it went like this. She sorted the 700 pounds by hand on the floor of her attic, and then on planks laid across sawhorses when the attic would not hold it, throwing out the rotted and the wormed and keeping the sound, and the sound was more than the town would have guessed, because a hard apple rots slower than a soft one. She washed it, she cut it, every apple, not peeled and not cored, for the peel and the core were where the set lived, only halved and quartered into the pot with the stems picked out, and her thumb bled from the paring knife the first week until it hardened. She covered the cut fruit barely with water, and she cooked it slow, not hard, a long, low simmer until the whole potful went soft and pale and broke down into a steaming mash, and the smell of it filled the harness shop below until the deaf old chairmender came up to see what she was at. Then came the part that cannot be hurried, the part that is the whole soul of the thing, the straining. She took an old clean flour sack and she scalded it, and she hung it from a nail with a crock beneath, and she ladled the hot mash into it, and she let it drip. And here was the law she learned, and never once broke after the first ruined batch taught it to her. You do not squeeze the bag, you let it hang and drip of its own weight, all the night through, slow, drop by drop, however long it takes, because the moment you squeeze it to hurry the juice, you push the pulp through, and your jelly goes cloudy, and will not clear again, not ever. She squeezed the first bag, being poor and impatient and not yet wise, and she got a crock of muddy juice that set into a dull, opaque brick, and she looked at it a long time, and she wrote in her book what she had done wrong, and she never did it again. After that she let it hang. She let it hang all night while she slept beside it on the floor, and in the morning, the juice in the crock was clear as weak wine and pale gold, and that was the fruit finally giving up its truest thing to the patient hand, exactly as the old man had said. Then she measured. This was where the record earned its keep, for she measured the clear juice and she measured the sugar against it, and she wrote both numbers down every single time, and she boiled it hard now, hard and fast in the wide part of the pot to drive the water off, skimming the pale foam from the top with her mother's worn spoon and keeping it, and she watched for the one moment that decides everything, the setting point, the instant the boiling juice stops running off the spoon in drops and begins to sheet off it in a single falling curtain, the sign that it will gel. She learned to read that moment by eye and by a cold saucer she kept in the window, dropping a little of the boil onto the cold plate and pushing it with her finger to see if it wrinkled. And when it wrinkled, she pulled the pot off the fire that second, not a moment after, and she poured the jelly hot into the jars she had scalded, and she sealed them. And in the night they ticked as they cooled and drew down. And in the morning they had set, clear and red and firm, garnet held to a lamp. And then she did it again. That is the part no one wants to hear, and the part that is the truth of every real thing. She did it again, and again, batch after batch, all that first autumn, and most of the batches that first year were not good enough. And she knew it, because she watched and tasted and wrote it down. This tree too woody. This batch boiled a half-minute long and gone stiff and dull. This one pulled too soon and syrupy. And she fed the failures to no one, and sold them to no one. She set them on a shelf as lessons, and read them like pages. The first winter she made perhaps 30 good jars out of 700 pounds and 100 failures, and she ate her own plain bread with her own good jelly on it, and paid $3 more off her debt from the little she could sell to the 2 or 3 neighbors curious enough to try, and by the measure the county used she had wasted a season. By her measure she had learned the fruit. Season after season she went back up the hill for the free windfall and carried it down and did it all again. Better each year, the second autumn and the third, culling her trees, learning which of the 200 set hardest and tasted deepest, and marking them in her book by their place on the hill, and time went by in the only way time truly goes by, slowly, in seasons, in bleeding thumbs and cold mornings, and a book filling up with small even writing, until the day the thing she was making got too good to laugh at. The first proof that could not be argued with came in the third autumn, at the county fair, and it came almost by accident, because Della did not enter things at fairs, having no dollar to spare on ribbons, and no habit of putting herself forward. It was the chairmender who took a jar of her red crab jelly in his pocket without telling her, and set it on the fair table among the entries, under her name, and it sat there among the sweet clear jellies of the good farmwives, and where theirs were pretty and soft and pale, hers stood up in the jar, firm enough to hold the shape of the glass when it was turned out, clear as a jewel and dark as a garnet, and when the judge, an old woman who had been judging jellies for 30 years and had never in her life tasted a thing that made her go quiet, tasted it, she went quiet. She tasted it again. She held it to the light and turned it and set it down and asked whose it was, and they told her, the widow Roan, the one who paid $6 for the alt-spitters, and the old judge did not laugh. She gave it the blue ribbon, and she wrote on the card in her own hand that it was the finest set jelly she had judged in the county in 20 years. And the crowd that came through the tent that afternoon read the card and looked at the jar and remembered the laughing on the courthouse steps, and something turned over in the county that day that does not turn back. That was the same autumn the buried thing began to surface, for by then Della had a little money at last, not much but enough, and she wanted the fruit safe and near, and not a thing she rented off the county's mercy year to year, and so she had done a quiet thing the winter before that no one had marked. She had gone to the courthouse, to the soft-handed clerk who kept the tax rolls, and she had asked after the old Alt Hill, and she had learned it stood forfeit, that the taxes on it ran unpaid for near 40 years, and the county held it against a debt no heir would ever come to clear, and she had asked what it would take to redeem it, and been told a figure so small, for land nobody wanted, that she paid it out of jelly money over 2 visits, $11.40 in back taxes and the clerk's fee, and had it recorded, the deed to the 40 acres and the stone ruin and the wild trees, in her own name, Della Roan, witnessed and stamped and entered in the book, and she folded that receipt too, and put it with the other, and told not one living soul. And so it was her own hill she climbed that third autumn to clear brush for a proper drying floor, and it was her own wall she pulled the ivy from, and it was there, dragging the dead ash and the brambles out of the long, low room, that her shovel rang on a flat stone that was not the floor, and she knelt and cleared it. And under it, in the dark, she heard, before she saw, water running, cold and steady and close. And she put her hand down into the channel, and the cold came up her arm exactly, like the cold she had felt come off the wall 3 winters before, and never forgotten. And she understood all at once, kneeling on the floor of the roofless house, what she had bought for $11.40, and what the Alts had built, and why the house was cool in August, and she sat back on her heels in the ruin, with her hand dripping, and she did not say anything, because there was no one to say it to, and some things are too large for the plain, flat voice to hold. The spring had waited 40 years in the dark to be found. She had found it. And within the month, so had someone else, though she did not know it yet, someone who had been watching her, and he came up the road in a good coat with a leather case, all sunshine and gentle regret, to take it. His name was Renner, Mr. Aldous Renner, and he was a buyer for a preserving works in the city 60 miles off, and he arrived on a bright, cold morning in a hired rig with a leather case on his knees, and he was everything Della was not, well-fed and well-spoken and easy, with a warm, quick way of talking that filled a room and left no space in it for anyone else. He had heard, he said, of her remarkable little jelly. All the way to the city he had heard of it, and he had come himself, personally, which she must understand was not a thing he did for just anyone, because he believed in helping the deserving, and he could see at a glance, he said, looking around the poor, clean stone house with its new-laid floor and its rows of ticking jars, that she was deserving, that she had worked so very hard. A woman alone, and it moved him, it truly did. And then, gently, over the good coffee she did not have, and so over her plain water instead, he laid out his kindness, which was a contract, drawn up already, pages of it, that he slid across the plank toward her with 2 fingers. The works would take her entire output, every jar she could make, at a fixed price, a fair price he called it, though it was a third of what her jelly already brought at her own door. And in return, they would put it up in their own glass, under their own label, with their own name, and she would never again have to trouble herself with the selling or the fetching or the waiting on custom. She would only make, and they would do the rest. And was that not a mercy? Was that not exactly the security a woman in her position, alone as she was, with no man and no backing, and the winter so hard, ought to seize with both hands while it was offered? Because these things, he said, warmly, regretfully, were not offered twice. And the market was a cruel place to a small maker standing alone, and he would truly hate, to see her lose everything she had built for the want of a wise decision made in time. She read the pages. She read every page while he talked, slowly, with her finger under the lines the way she read everything, and he took her slowness for the slowness of a simple woman overwhelmed by her good fortune, and he talked on to fill the silence, being a man who could not abide a silence, and the more she said nothing, the more he said. And that was his flaw, the flaw of his whole smooth kind, that he could not stop talking, and that his talking, in the end, always gave him away. She set the pages down. She said she would think on it, and he, sure of her, sure of the winter and her weakness and the size of his kindness, made ready to go, gathering his case, and at the door, easy and expansive and pleased with himself, he made the one small mistake that told her everything, and once he had made it, he could not call it back. He turned at the door, and he looked down the long room at the channel in the floor, and he said, warm as ever, that she really had found herself a treasure up here, that a cold spring like that, and the old alt-red still bearing on the hill, was worth more than she could know, that a body could build a proper preserving house on a water source like that, and never want for ice, and he smiled and touched his hat, and said it was a wonder the old family had ever capped it and let it lie. And Della, who had told no living soul about the spring under the stone, who had uncovered the capped head of it with her own hands not a month before, and spoken of it to no one, not to the neighbors, not to the clerk, not even out loud to herself, stood very still. She looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. And she said only one thing, 4 words, the shortest thing said in that whole long room that morning. You knew it was there. And in the small silence after, which she let stand and did not fill, the whole shape of it came clear between them without another word needing to be said, that this smooth, kind man had not heard of her by accident, and had not driven 60 miles for a poor widow's little jelly, that he or his works had known for a good while what was on that hill, the old proven cider stock and the cold cap spring, that they had likely known it back when it stood forfeit, and had meant to have it cheap for the taxes, and been beaten to it, quietly, over 2 visits and $11.40, by a woman they had not thought to watch. His wanting it proved its worth. His knowing of the spring proved the whole hill had never been worthless at all, that the county had been wrong to laugh, that she had been right, and worse for him, it proved he had come not to lift her up, but to buy out from under her, cheap and legal and kind, the thing she had already made her own. He recovered fast, being smooth, and he changed his tune to paper, which was the only weapon his kind ever truly carried. Within the fortnight there came, not from him but from a lawyer of the works, a letter and then a man, claiming that the old alt-red was a registered stock, a named variety propagated by a nursery the works had bought up the assets of years before, and that the trees on the hill, and therefore their fruit, and therefore any jelly made of that fruit, were the licensed property of the works, and that Miss Roan was kindly warned to cease trading upon a variety she did not own before the matter became unpleasant and costly, as such matters so regrettably did for those without the means to fight them. It was meant to frighten her off the hill and into his contract, and it was built, like all his kind's papers, on the sure bet that a poor woman alone would have no fact to answer it with and no record to stand on. But she had the record. She had always had the record. That was the whole of it, the thing the town had looked at for 3 years and called a sad little habit, the nickel ledger and the folded receipts, and it answered him flat. She did not go to the lawyer weeping, and she did not go to the contract at all. She took her book to the same soft-handed clerk at the courthouse, and she laid it open beside the deed already entered there in her own name. Della Roan, the 40 acres and the ruin, and every wild tree on it, redeemed lawfully out of 40 years of the work's own neglect, recorded and stamped and witnessed a full year before their lawyer ever licked a stamp. She laid beside it the tax receipt she had folded and kept, $11.40, and the fare card in the old judge's hand naming the jelly hers, and she laid beside it the plain fact, which old Silas would swear to, and which the oldest men in the county would confirm once reminded, that the alt-red had been raised from seed on that hill 70 years gone, long before any nursery the works ever bought, so that it was no man's registered stock, it was the hill's own, and the hill was hers. The nursery the works claimed through had dissolved into bankruptcy 15 years before, its registrations lapsed and void, and any first claim to the land it might once have chased had died with the forfeiture and passed clean to whoever redeemed the taxes, which was her. There was nothing in it for a court but her deed and their neglect. She wrote to the works, one page, in her small, even hand, and she set out the facts in order: the deed, the date, the dissolution, the origin of the fruit, and she did not threaten, and she did not gloat. She only counted the facts out like coins on a counter, and she folded the letter and sent it, and she went back to her jelly. There was no case, because a case is built on the other party having no fact, and she had every fact, kept in a nickel book from the first winter she owned nothing else. Mr. Renner did not come up the hill again. She had beaten him without raising her voice, without a lawyer, without a dollar spent on the fight, and the weapon had been the very habit they had pitied her for. She had watched, she had remembered, she had kept the record, and that was the whole of the counter, the vindication of it. The part that turned the whole county, and not just one smooth man, came the very next year, and it came as those things come, out of the weather, which answers to no one's contract. It was a killing spring, a late hard frost that dropped down into the valley on a warm May night, when every good orchard on the flats stood in full pink bloom, and it burned the blossom black on the sweet dessert trees the whole county had staked itself on, the pretty railroad apples, and where the frost did not get them a wet cold summer brought the rot, so that come autumn the flatland orchards had either almost no fruit at all, or a glut of soft bruised stuff that would not keep a week, and the price of it fell through the floor, and the good farm wives who put up the sweet clear jellies every fall found their pale soft juice would not set that year for love nor sugar, batch after batch weeping and cloudy and sliding off the bread, because there was no strength in a frost-shocked sweet apple to hold a set, and there never had been, they had only never been made to notice before. And up on the hill, above the frost line, above the killing cold that pooled in the flats, the old wild alt trees that no one had planted or pruned or prayed over bore that year exactly as they bore every year, faithful, indifferent, better than 200 of them, heavy with hard, sour, red-streaked fruit, 700 pounds and more of it, thick with the very strength the sweet apples lacked, and Della Roan made her clear, firm garnet jelly out of it as she had made it every autumn, and hers set hard as it always set, and hers kept, and hers held its worth while every conventional jelly in the county turned to cloudy failure or sold for pennies, and the fruit the whole valley had laughed at on the courthouse steps was, that one hard year, the only fruit in the county worth a thing. The mocked thing saved the mockers. They came up the hill because there was nowhere else to go, and that is how the line began. She could have named any price that autumn and they would have paid it, and she named a fair one, and I want to be plain about what fair means, because it is the whole of her, the pivot of the entire matter. She did not gouge them, and she did not give it away either, for she was no fool and no saint, and she had 11 years of debt and cold behind her to remember. She set her price at what the work was honestly worth, which was more than a poor woman's jelly and less than a desperate town's fear would have paid. A firm, fair price she wrote at the top of the ledger page and did not move from no matter who stood at the door, the rich wife or the poor one, the same. And to the ones who came with nothing, the frost-ruined smallholders and the widows worse off than she had been, she did the thing that was the true win, the thing the money was never the point of. She extended them credit. On a handshake and a name written in the book, she let them carry the jelly home against the spring, a jar and 2 jars, and she wrote down what they owed the way Crandall had once written down what she owed, only without the interest, and near every one of them paid her back when they could, because a person remembers who fed them the year the frost came, and the few who never paid she carried on the page and never once spoke of. That was the win, not the 41 names waiting to buy, the names she let carry at home who could not yet pay. And now you can stand again in that cold October morning where we began, and see it whole. The ticking on the plank is the jar's ceiling, drawn down by the same slow cooling that set the first 30 she ever made in the attic over the harness shop. The line out the low door in the frost is the county that laughed on the courthouse steps, come back with its hats in its hands, 9 miles some of them, to a widow they had pitied and given up on, and the $6 is the $6. The whole of it began with $6 laid on a step, and a room full of men laughing, 700 pounds of garbage hauled off in a borrowed cart, and by October, the 41 names on the nail by the door, the waiting list for a thing made out of the one thing nobody wanted, in a stone house nobody remembered, over a spring that ran 40 years in the dark waiting to be found. Every laugh had come back around. Not one word of it had she had to say. The jelly said it, and the line said it, and the clear red garnet of it held to the small east window said it, and she stood at the plank in the cold, and wiped the jars and turned them to the light and kept her record. And that was answer enough, and it was all the answer she ever gave. And the years closed over it the way the water closed over the stone. Old Silas, who had put the key in her hand at the cart and taken nothing for it, did not go on living poor in the shack by the creek, for she gave him the making of the hard perry and the sour cider he had known in the old country, on her own hill and at her own spring, and paid him a wage and a share, and called it his by right and not his by charity. And he grew old up there in the cool of the stone house, among the smell of pressed fruit he had thought never to smell again, and he died content one winter in a warm bed with the sound of the spring under the floor, which is as good an end as this world hands out. The smooth man Renner was gone, back to his city and his works and his papers, and the county spoke of him no more, and he did not come again. Crandall's $91 was paid to the last cent by the second good autumn, and the receipt for it she folded and kept with the others, the whole thin sheaf of her life in folded paper. And the child, the thin grave girl in the too big coat who had stood apart from the line, waiting to be let in. She had come to Della 3 winters before, out of the same misfortune the whole thing was made of, half orphaned when the frost took her father's flatland orchard, and then the fever took the father, and she had come up the hill with nothing, the way Della had come into the valley with nothing, and Della had taken her in and taught her, not charity, the making, the whole of it, the sorting and the long low simmer and the law of the bag you never squeeze, and the reading of the setting point off the back of a cold spoon, and above all the keeping of the record, the small even hand, the book. The girl kept her own book now. She grew up straight and quiet, with jelly-stained fingers, and a way of watching things that most people never noticed and never priced. And when Della was old, truly old, and her hands had gone slow, it was the girl, a grown woman by then, who stood at the plank in the cold, and turned the jars to the light, and wrote the morning's count in the ledger, so that the knowing did not die with the one who had earned it, but ran on past her the way the spring ran on under the floor. And Della grew old on her own hill, in the stone house with a good roof on it now, and the spring cold in the channel, and the wild trees bearing every faithful autumn on the slope below. And she was not rich the way the city counts rich, but she wanted for nothing and owed no one. And the county that had pitied her had long since stopped, and come instead to her funeral in numbers, hats in hand, the way they had come to the door. And near the end of her life, on a cold, bright autumn morning, much like the first one, a young woman she did not know came up the road. A stranger, poor by the look of her, with a hard flat set to her face that Della knew from the inside, come to ask about work or about the trees, or only, maybe, to look at the one place in the county where a woman alone had made something out of nothing. And Della, old and slow at the plank, picked up one of the small, ugly, red-streaked crabs from the basket and turned it in her fingers and pressed it against the ball of her thumb to feel how it held, exactly as an old man had shown her at a cart 40 years before. And she put it in the young stranger's hand and closed the cold fingers over it, and she said the thing that had been said to her, the same words, in the same plain voice, present tense, the way you say a thing that is true and will go on being true after you. The sourest fruit keeps the truest sweetness, and it gives it up to no one but the patient hand. And she did not say anything after that, and the young woman looked at the little hard apple in her palm, and did not yet understand it, and would, in time, and out beyond them both, under the floor of the stone house, in the dark where it had run for 40 years before anyone came, and would run for 40 more after they were gone. The spring went on over the cold stone, steady and low and sure, saying its one low word again and again to no one, never once in all that time, having been told how to stop.